All right, so we're up here in the spare room at Wellspring Church going through Able Project videos. We're talking about blessed today and specifically enemy love. So we know a lot about Jesus' teaching there, but let's go back to the beginning.
Sure, yeah.
So let's go through the scriptures. So where does this sort of start?
Yeah, well, I think really anchoring it in Genesis 1 and 2 and seeing the divine ideal, creation, God creates, it's good, it's good, it's good. Humans are created on day 6. And there's this like really beautiful shalom, this peace and this intimacy with God, with humanity, with creation, with one another.
They're going on walks in the afternoon.
It's delightful, it's awesome. And so you have this beautiful picture in the first 2 chapters of what it's meant to be like. With this harmony, this peace, this love that's just all around.
No division, no violence.
Exactly. But unfortunately what happens, and we kind of know the story, right? Genesis 3, humans rebel, they choose to go their own way. And unfortunately, one of the first stories...
The first story!
After that, it's like a tragedy, and it's only going to continue to get worse. But that first story is now humans are at essentially war with each other.
Cain
Sibling
and Abel,
rivalry.
right? Murder,
for sure.
The first story east of Eden is murder.
Right? And this
inability to love your enemy.
Exactly. And so all that continues to happen is that it just spirals more and more out of control.
Which is one of the main reasons for the flood, right? If you read through those narratives, it's like violence,
it's violence that grieves the heart of God in Genesis 6. And so even though the flood happens, there's still this ability for humans to continue to rebel against one another and ultimately against God.
So it leads to Genesis 11, the building of Tower of
Tower of Babylon. And that whole story in Genesis 10 and 11 is depicted as really the nations of the earth coming together in like a pseudo-unity, if you will, because it's unity against God. And there's this rebellion against God. God comes down, he looks at that, he scatters them, but then God's plan and his heart is to not just, destroy his enemies or whatever. His plan in Genesis 12 is to call out of the families of the world,
out of his enemies,
right? To call Abraham and his family to essentially bless the families of the world. And in context, this is really important, the pairing of Genesis 11 and 12, is that the call for Abraham and his family to bless the nations of the world in context
are the very people he just sort of sent around the world.
And the very people who are essentially just like sticking it to God in Genesis 10 and 11. And so what this gets at is Genesis 11 or Genesis 12 forward is really God's heart and God's plan of redemption to bless his enemies. That's going to carry on through the rest of the biblical narrative.
That's important, right? Because now we're anchoring this in the call of Abraham, which is the father of Israel. I mean, this is sort of the beginning of the formation of God's people throughout history.
For sure, and to see that as God's people, Israel, they're ultimately not just to be about Israel for Israel, but to be about for the rest of the nations. And so as Israel ends up in slavery to one of the enemies, if you will, Pharaoh in Egypt, they're rescued out of slavery. But you get these kind of Easter eggs or hints, if you will, of like not just it all being about Israel, but God letting in others, wanting others to be a part of this.
So even like when the people of Israel are in Egypt, they're set free, there's these hints that people outside of Israel are included. Foreigners are included.
Yes, and it's becomes this multi-ethnic. It's not just one-dimensional as far as Israel goes. God is welcoming people from the outside to be a part of this plan of restoration.
Even after Mount Sinai, he's including, like, he says, hey, when foreigners come among you, treat them this way. Treat them kindly.
Exactly. There's all these provisions in the Torah with some of the gleaning laws and other instructions that have these provisions in place that benefit not just Israel, but Israel's neighbors and even Israel's enemies.
And so even when they're conquering Jericho, Rahab is blessed through that process.
Exactly. Rahab is blessed. Caleb, one of the primary leaders in the Joshua generation, is a Kenizzite, which if you're like a really, paying attention to all these little details with all the ites, he's one of, or the Kenizzites are one of those groups that Israel is called to drive out of the promised land.
So they're called to drive out, and yet he's included, and he's a central part of God's plan.
Exactly. He's the one that's like, I'm going to lead the charge. I have the faith, Numbers 13:14. And so he's one of the, quote, good guys, if you will. But he's an outsider, the enemy, if you will, being brought in. And so this pattern of God bringing in what, Israel might consider an enemy, the other, is really at the heartbeat of, it kind of percolates throughout the rest of the Old Testament. So you get, into the prophets, Isaiah, chapter 2, Isaiah 19, into the rest of Isaiah speaks of all these nations coming in, these outsiders, Assyria, Egypt.
For a big feast.
For a big feast, right? And God would use, or the prophets will use this language of these groups are, quote, my people.
Yeah.
And that language of my people, especially earlier in the Old Testament, was reserved for Israel.
Yeah.
And now this my people is being expanded to even Israel's
perceived enemies. Yeah.
Exactly.
And then, but Israel doesn't always respond to this. That's the thing with the story of Jonah.
For sure. The story of Jonah, which is like fairly famous story. It's in our children's Bibles and whatnot. But Jonah really is about this character, this prophet, this man of God, if you will, who really struggles with God's enemy love.
Yeah.
Because he personally, when you read the last chapter, is like, the reason I did not want to listen to you, the reason I did not want to go.
I knew you were going to forgive these people.
Exactly. I knew this is who you are, God. You are an enemy-loving God. Yeah. And the story of Jonah is about really seeing in the Old Testament God's heart, not just for Israel, but even for Nineveh and Assyria, like the big bad empire of the day that had all these evil practices, that was going to be one of the main nations to haul Israel out of their land and into exile. Yeah. God is having this prophet Jonah go preach a message of good news and mercy to them. Yeah. And Jonah wants nothing to do with it.
No way.
No way. Right? And so what you see is, well, you mentioned Jesus earlier. Yeah. This is not, something Jesus just thought of by himself. Yeah. Jesus was raised on these stories. He knows the story of Abraham. He knows the plan of God. And he comes to bring the fulfillment of that for sure, to the point where we see in the person of Jesus this on beautifully full display. Yeah. So, one of the classic passages.
Well, before we get there, Romans 5, right? This idea of God sent his only son, right, to reconcile basically his enemies.
His enemies, right?
Right. So this is in the person of God, even in the sending of his son to reconcile us. But
in its core, yes.
And then also, I want to say, before we even get to the teaching of Jesus in Matthew 5, we also see the calling of Jesus' disciples. Yes. That this is actually a community of people that are enemies.
Yeah, the tax
collector, the zealot. Yes. It's like, wait, he's bringing actually enemies together as he's forming, and he's modeling enemy love in his community, and then he teaches
about this.
Matthew 5, I was thinking about. I can read it just real quick. This is Matthew 5:38. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. And then he keeps going. Now, I just want to clarify here, because I do think sometimes we can read this and think, wait, I'm not supposed to resist? What does that mean? We sometimes think of it as do not resist the evil person. But another way to translate this is do not resist by evil means. Yeah. So the way we resist should not be evil. And this is echoed throughout, right? Paul talks about this in Romans 12, right? Do not repay evil for evil, overcome evil for good. Yeah. And we see this in Jesus' life. He does resist the Pharisees, right? For sure. He does resist Satan when he's tempting him, in the desert. Right? Totally. There are definitely moments where Jesus is resisting, but he doesn't resist in an evil way.
Yeah, and that's key, because at the heart of what Jesus is saying later on in Matthew 5 is that we are to love our enemies, we're to pray for those who persecute us, and we have this posture because this is what God is like. Going again back to the Old Testament, fully displayed in Jesus, his death on the cross for us as enemies. And then Jesus even ends that teaching in Matthew 5 there with enemy love, with that line that's I just was thinking of this, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And we might kind of think that and pull that out of oh, that's be a good moral person. Yeah. But in context, I think what he's talking about is be whole and complete. It's that same word, telos. Right? Whole and complete in the sense that we are an enemy-loving kind of person.
We're not divided.
We're not divided, exactly. Yeah. And so just like God is enemy-loving towards us, so we are to be, or at least as best we can by the grace of God, the kind of person who loves and prays for even those that we don't like, are hard to get along with, and are our enemies.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, and we see this in the life of Jesus, in the life of Paul, life of Peter. These people that resist.
Yes, totally.
They do resist.
Yes.
But in the end, Jesus dies on a cross, right? Paul is beheaded.
Yes.
Peter is likely crucified. These people that they don't resist by evil means. At some point, they're not willing to pick up a sword and just start kill their enemy.
Totally, for sure. And just again, this is the core to, I think, the way of Jesus is to be this kind of person. And again, it comes back to, I think, the great commandment: love God, love neighbor. Yeah. And really, this is the hardest part of this is learning to love our enemies in light of that, for sure.
And then, so how do we? Right, we're not talking about nation states now. We're trying to talk about how does an individual human being, a person of a church, someone attending Wellspring, how do they lean into this?
For sure, yeah. And I think specifically going back to Matthew 5, Jesus, I think, gives us a few hints in that direction, right? And so he talks about praying for our enemies, praying for those who persecute us. Yeah. And we might think, I don't have any enemies, number one, or I can't do that, or whatever. But I think there's something really like profound here. And I think I've experienced this even in my own life to a certain degree of, even if it's a short prayer, and I mean like 2 seconds, just even starting that process of praying for someone who's annoying or you don't like, or really is your enemy.
Well, I think that's helpful. Like, so sometimes we think of enemy and we think, oh, well, do I really have an enemy? Okay, so think about someone you don't like, someone you find annoying, someone who's hurt you. And start praying for them.
Totally, and just see like what happens as far as how God meets you in that space, what goes on in your own heart. And to notice that can be a moment in a place where God begins to work, not only in and through your prayer for that person, but also in your own heart as you grow. And it's not going to be perfect, and it's going to be hard as you become more of a person who does show love and demonstrate love for your enemies.
The only other thing I was thinking about, or one of the other things I was thinking about, was just this idea of just listening. Because I do think there's this sort of connection between our willingness to love our enemies and our willingness to listen to them. And so, like, are you really listening to those people?
For sure.
And this, I think, especially is true in our cultural moment.
Totally. So divisive.
Where we just sort of, we exist in these echo chambers, especially politically, and we don't really give much actual like brain, heart, mind attention to what they're saying.
For sure.
And I think that's often a way that we refuse to love them.
Totally.
And we don't have to agree.
Exactly.
But we can listen.
Listen well. And I think it even reminds me of something Tim Keller has often said, of being able to listen to the point where you're not thinking, oh, how can I be combative and know tear your argument down, but listen in such a way where you could even restate their opinion or what they're thinking, and they would go, oh, you genuinely understand.
That's good.
And you have genuinely heard what I've said. And listening is an act, I think, of love. And to be actually listened to and to be heard, really, I think, is a way to embody the love of Jesus. And in particular, this enemy love.
And honor the personhood versus objectify someone as just the other.
The other, that's the argument or whatever, for sure.
I also was thinking about how King had this line, like, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I just think sometimes we dismiss the ways in our small little lives where we have opportunities to love our enemy and we think, it doesn't really matter.
It's not a big deal.
But I think actually, like, those are our opportunities to embody the kingdom and the love of Jesus, of just saying either we love our enemy by acknowledging our faults or listening or praying for, but there's these small ways I think we can lean into this that can be profound.
For sure. Those small acts of faithfulness, I think, can go a profoundly good long way.
Can you think of anything else?
Yeah, and I think for me, just thinking about how the story ends, right? Where God redeems and reconciles all things, and we are in the family of God together, to see like that's the end. And to recognize that there will be people in that new creation that right now we probably don't get along with. And I think that's going to be true for almost all of us. And to recognize that, again, it's hard, it's difficult, it's not always easy. I've been there before. I'm still kind of in there to a certain degree. But even those small acts of faithfulness as a way of anticipating that full and complete reconciliation and redemption that we will one day experience. I think seeing that big picture at least gives me hope and comfort. And to recognize that, even in the language of Paul, that we have been called to be ambassadors of reconciliation. We're called to represent Jesus' love in the world. So this is, I think, not just like, a tertiary sort of like down the list sort of thing. This is like core to being a follower of Jesus.
It's good.
It's core to being a disciple of his. So.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
It's good.